Welcome back to Straightforward, Levant TV's political debate show discussing recent developments on the ever-changing Middle East scene. Last week, we've seen a remarkable visit of a US president to the Saudi kingdom. How would the visit affect the Middle East, especially on the eve of 4 presidential elections in Iraq, Syria, Egypt, and the Lebanon? Has the decision been made on who's presiding these 4 countries? What did Obama achieve in his visit? And now the line of succession to the throne has been rearranged. Would King Abdullah be receiving a US president or any other president for the last time ever? First of all, I would like to thank our guests for coming to the studios. With us today is Mr. William Spring, political commentator. Thank you very much for coming. And we also have MP Jeremy Corbyn from the Labour Party. Thank you very much again for coming. And on our guest list also, we have joining us through the phone later is a British journalist and political commentator Adil Darwish. As this episode will be British by excellence, we will look at the US relations and developments in the Middle East in general, but we will touch on the UK position in the Middle East as well. But before we start our discussion, let us have a look at this report.
Decades, the United States and Saudi Arabia forged a strategic alliance that became a linchpin of the regional order, a liberal democracy and an ultra-conservative monarchy united by shared interest in the stability of the Middle East and the continued flow of oil. Saudi Arabia's leaders had historically favoured a quiet, backstage approach to international relations. They preferred to use their oil wealth to buy influence from behind the scenes, while allies like Egypt and the United States led the way out front. But the United States has scaled back its military role in the region after the war in Iraq, and since the Arab Spring, Egypt has been consumed by its own internal turmoil. The Saudis have sometimes financed jihadists abroad when it served their interests, for example in Afghanistan during the 1980s and now in Syria. But the Saudi royal family, which draws its legitimacy from an ultra-conservative Salafi branch of Islam, has long feared the Muslim Brotherhood because of its rival blend of religion and politics and its effectiveness at political organizing. But the country's open support for the military ouster of the Muslim Brotherhood has risks as well. The takeover and crackdown have elicited stirrings of dissent from Saudi clerics sympathetic to the Brotherhood, and around the region Saudi Arabia is losing friends left and right.
Mr. Corbyn, starting with you, let's start with your views on what is happening in Saudi. Why would the US president go all the way to Saudi Arabia, and why now, given that the Saudi-US disparity has been going on for a while?
I think Obama is trying to bury the hatchet with a lot of people in the Middle East region. The whole US foreign policy trajectory is moving to Asia Pacific, and what they want to do is develop alliances in Europe and the Middle East who will not only take up the US military roles in the region, but also pay for the US military role in the region. So his speech on the Ukraine and NATO expansion was absolutely specific when he spoke in Brussels, saying, yes, we're quite prepared to get involved in NATO expansion in Europe, but you've got to pay for it, we're not paying for it. The whole trajectory in the Middle East is to build up the Gulf Cooperation Council, to continue supplying arms and weapons to the Gulf Cooperation Council, in the full knowledge that many of those weapons are going to end up being used fueling the conflict in Syria and elsewhere. And I think this was all about building those relations. It was nothing to do with political engagement, democracy building, human rights, rights of women, or anything of that sort. It was solely a visit for those reasons. And like most heads of government visits to Saudi Arabia, they're accompanied by a whole phalanx of people busy selling arms and other things to the kingdom.
Mm-hmm. And William Spring, what would you have to say about the timing of the visit?
I think it may well be connected with Iran, whereas the Asia-Pacific region is also important. I think the immediate focus for American diplomacy is to stop the Saudis taking the hump, putting it very bluntly, over their relationship with Iran, because there is a re-engagement, a rapprochement with Iran, yes, which the Saudis must be very worried about, because the Saudis are not the natural leaders of the Middle East in the way the Iranians are.
What do you mean when you say the natural leaders?
Well, one gets the impression that the Persians, if I use the old term, have got far more to give to to the Middle East than the Saudis.
In what department?
Well, in many areas. I mean, intellectually, they have a developed state which has come through many tribulations, difficulties, and sanctions, wars, and whatever, and yet they are still a solid country. It's unlike Iraq, which was a line drawn on a map, really. Iran is a nation. And this is where the Americans have really lost the plot right at the beginning, back in the 1920s, when they first turned up in Saudi Arabia simply for oil and for no other purpose. Standard Oil turned up. And you cannot have a relationship just based on oil.
Mr. Jeremy Corbyn, in a piece in Al-Monitor, Al-Rasheed looks at the appointment of Prince Mukren as Deputy Crown Prince, which reveals a trend towards multiple power centers within the royal family. She even considers that it's about time when Saudi Arabia is seen as a kingdom with multiple heads. Are multiple heads a challenge to foreign governments dealing with Saudi, as Al-Rasheed portrays it, or could this not be seen by these governments as an opportunity?
I think the Western governments are very used to dealing with the arcane politics of the Saudi royal family, and they're quite good at it. They're quite good at playing off one crown prince against another, and they've been quite effective at that for a very long time. But the interesting thing is that Saudi Arabia is somehow or other treated differently. Others would say around the world, why are we dealing with absolute monarchs? Why are we dealing with an exclusive monarchy where there is no real democracy at all, where there is no elected power structure? There's an elected parliament that can have a relationship with the royal family, but it cannot control what the royal family does. All the aces are held by the royal family. So I think the worry would be that the feuding, and it is feuding, between the various princes will actually spill over into something far worse within Saudi Arabia. But at the same time, Saudi Arabia does have quite an assertive foreign policy. I mean, it's not been shy of going into Yemen, it's not been shy of going into Bahrain, it's not been shy of getting involved in Syria. So I think there are concerns all around there. And I guess the Obama visit and the statements others have made is all about trying to build a relationship with this rather complicated, warring royal family.
It does apply as well to Kuwait, to Qatar, and most of the oil monarchies.
Indeed, the royal families throughout the region are all powerful to varying degrees. In the case of Kuwait, there is a more effective form of parliamentary scrutiny, but it doesn't control it in its entirety. There is still a huge monarchy power there. Other countries, the same kind of issue arises, but it's quite interesting that when it comes to questions of human rights, it comes to standards of democracy and accountability, there's a sort of glossing over of all of that because they are massive purchasers of Western arms and equipment, and they of course enormous suppliers of oil. And since the new US strategy is to isolate Russia, there is going to be a gas and oil supply problem for Western Europe, less so for the United States, but certainly for Western Europe from now on. And therefore they've got to increase supplies from somewhere else.
That's interesting. Also joining us over the phone is Adil Darwish, Westminster-based British political journalist, author, historian, broadcaster and political commentator, specializing on foreign affairs, especially Middle Eastern politics. Mr. Darwish, thank you very much for joining us.
Hello, good afternoon, good evening.
Good evening. David Hurst says in the Huffington Post that what binds Saudi Arabia and the UAE is not the fear of Iran, nor is it the civil war in Syria. It is the need to keep a lid on Egypt, which they correctly identify as the game changer in the Arab world. Now, my question, Mr. Darwish, is do you really agree with that? And if yes, why? And why is Egypt before Syria?
Sorry, I didn't get the question. Agree on what? I mean, what do they see in Egypt? I mean, they see that the sort of sorting out Egypt and getting it into stability is actually a key issue in stability in the Middle East. Is that what you meant?
Yes, they believe so. They believe the writer believes so. The Huffington Post writer. But why do you agree with him?
Well, no, I won't actually agree with him personally, but I agree that Egypt's stability is actually a key to stability in the region. The whole idea of the Arab League, which started after World War II, with the British idea of an axis of stability between Riyadh and Cairo, obviously supported by London, and the Muslim Brotherhood project to take over the Middle East and implement the international agenda was actually by taking over Egypt. So Egypt is actually a key sort of nation in stability in the region, and empowering the Egyptian people to have proper democracy, because the whole project of Muslim Brotherhood and democracy has been tried in Egypt from 1922 to 1954, incompatible.
Yes, and Adil Darwish also I'd like to ask you, on what grounds should a president in Egypt, a forthcoming president, be it Marshal Abdel Fattah al-Sisi or any other candidate, on what grounds should the president be pre-approved by Saudi Arabia? And do you think there have been any talks between Mr. Obama and King Abdullah regarding Marshal Abdel Fattah al-Sisi?
Well, the first, actually, the earlier suggestion are quite laughable. That an Egyptian president have to be pre-approved by Saudi Arabia. That's a lot of nonsense.
Can you elaborate on that?
Well, because no nation in the world will actually accept this premise. In fact, the Egyptian nationalists have been in discussion with them this morning, specifically actually on Skype, on the Egyptian Nationalist Party, Egypt Mother Party. And I was telling them, why you keep attacking Saudi Arabia? And they said, well, it's the source of Islamic fundamentalism. I said, no, it's actually on your side now, as an ally.
Yes.
But this is a load of nonsense. I mean, the Saudis, yes, the Saudis are supporting the Egyptians because they see that the Muslim brothers actually have the project are incompatible with their long-term strategy. In fact, they gave the Americans last week a huge file, which is the largest the Americans got from the Saudis, on the Muslim Brothers' terrorist activities and support of terrorism, which they shared with the British, the Americans. On the latter of what the Egyptian president to do, I think the Egyptians are getting it wrong, because they have, since 1952 coup, they went into a republican system where the president actually is head of a state but also head of a government, which is extremely confusing. I mean, they should go back to the parliamentary system that existed, that they have a head of a state who doesn't interfere as much in the day-to-day running of government, and the government should be a parliamentarian government, so it could be accountable. At present, it's like a French system or American system where the cabinet is appointed by the president and become less accountable and become less effective. So unless actually they change that system, it would be doomed to failure.
We'll see. Maybe Mr. Corbyn, do you agree with Mr. Darwish and what he just said, the points that he mentioned?
The Western powers started out misunderstanding what was called the Arab Spring, then accepted Morsi's election as president. Indeed, just before he was removed in a coup, he was actually due to visit London. Indeed, I had an invitation to meet him, but I got the most peculiar email saying he was no longer available.
Well, where did he go?
Prison. That's why he was not available. And then they then never used the words coup about the appointment of Sisi as acting president, and now, of course, as presidential candidate, very likely to become president of Egypt in the very near future. And I see they're kind of realigning things now to develop this relation with Saudi Arabia.
Adil Darwish, what do you have to say about not using the word coup when it came to the June takeover by Abdel Fattah al-Sisi when he did this public appearance with all the religious figures and minority group representatives.
Yes, see, I don't use the word coup, and in fact, it's not a takeover by Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. There's again a lot of nonsense, and there's an Orwellian rewriting of history. It's not that the army, in a classic term, woke up one morning or have been plotting to overthrow an elected government or an elected president. This is absolutely a lot of nonsense.
Right.
It's not even like Portugal in 1975 and 1976. It isn't. It is actually, there were 30 million people out in the street demanding that a change in government. And there was the army wants stability. Had it actually been the other way around, that it's minority of demonstrators against Morsi and the majority pro him, the army would have sided with him. The army wants stability. They do actually not want bloodshed on the streets. What would the army have done? Like the Syrian army would turn their tanks and fire at people. I mean, have you been in Cairo? Have Jeremy Corbyn been in Cairo?
Yes.
And I spent 5 years correspondent in Cairo, and we had in our bureau 6 people, but during that event we had 16 people in Cairo. It's actually from Tahrir Square all the way to the Presidential Palace. They're actually 6.5 miles. The streets were absolutely packed.
Yeah, but in return,
the talking military coup is actually Orwellian rewriting of history. But we used the coup because as journalists we don't have any other word for it, but it was not a classical coup. It was actually a takeover, and that's the correct term for it. And in fact, the army gave President Morsi a chance for a roadmap to go out on television and invite everyone else into an inclusive council of guidance. There, he went on television challenging everyone, sending coded messages to his supporters to start actually violence.
Yes.
So it's actually a lot of nonsense to call it a coup.
Well, I think you'd have to address a couple of points here, one of which is that whilst there were excesses under Morsi and there were abuses of human rights under Morsi, he wasn't actually in office particularly long. There's been a continuation of the reverse of those human rights abuses under Sisi, including the detention of a number of journalists, including the Al Jazeera crew, but many others also. It really is not an acceptable situation that a person appoints themselves president only a year after somebody else has been elected. It looks awfully like a transfer of power at the behest of the military in Egypt. If you don't want to use the word coup, we'll call it transfer of power with a bit of military support, because that's exactly what happened, surely.
Despite grassroots support in Tahrir Square?
Well, there was undoubtedly a grassroots support for the removal of Morsi, and many of those people that supported the removal of Morsi have now in turn been arrested by the army because they're seen to be inconvenient to the Sisi government. So those on the left that thought they were welcoming the change suddenly found that the military reached out and arrested them as well. What we have is a return to what Egypt has had for a very long time, and that is a domination by the armed forces of political and economic life in Egypt, and that is what's continuing.
Mr. Spring, what do you have to say about that to Mr. Adel Darwish, or to tell us about it?
Well, I think the Egyptian army, in a way, parallels the Turkish experience, where the army was the custodian of the constitution in their mind. Therefore, they regarded themselves in Turkey as superior to the politicians,
right,
and have the veto power, so they think, to get rid of the politicians, which is why the current president of Turkey has concentrated on removing the army leaders who could be a threat to him. Now, similarly in Egypt, the army is tied in with the old regime, le pouvoir, the moneyed classes, the Coptic church, the many factors that do not felt seriously threatened by Morsi's rewriting of the constitution. And I think that there is an element in this which is absolutely appalling. Of course, on one level, here's a democratic government overturned by force, But
and public opinion as well, maybe by the masses who demonstrated, similar to what happened in January the 25th, maybe.
Well, it's more similar to Ukraine, in a sense, because the Ukrainian opposition who've overturned Yanukovych, they were not, they didn't follow the constitution at all. They had support from the West to overturn Yanukovych. Equally, the current, the people in power in Cairo now had support from the West, who were readjusting all their contingency plans in this situation. But as I said on your program the other day, I fear that we've got to recognise that totalitarianism doesn't just come through the number of votes. Whilst it's true Morsi had the majority of the votes,
Yes.
the use of the power that he was given was very unwise. Hitler got the majority of the votes in the third,
Adil Darwish, I'm sure you agree with Mr. Spring on that note, is about the practice of President Morsi. Although Egypt is not the subject of this discussion, we're more touching as part of our Saudi alliances with the US, but Egypt is part of that. Now, while you deny that Saudi has a say in a forthcoming presidential election in Egypt, many others still believe that the Saudi and US leaders, when they meet, they do shape what happens in the Middle East. So what do you have to say about that? And why does the UK, what do you have to say about that? Yes.
Well, I mean, there's so many questions. I'm on one. I mean, first of all, actually, it's not, I don't 100% agree. I think there's a confusion, especially in the minds of the British left, between democracy and election. Okay, election is only one sort of part, one tool of democracy. When you have a whole sort of democratic institutions, accountability, checks and balances, this is actually democracy. I mean, it's the same system and the same tools by which Morsi was elected were actually used to elect Mubarak. Don't tell me that just because the revolution happened, they changed their habits and become less corrupt and all of that.
Yes.
So the whole question of being that Morsi and the government being democratic, very, very questionable. Secondly, you have Ukraine situation. Okay,
yes.
Where a democratic elected government overthrown by public movement supported by the West. Is that because the Ukrainians are white race and the Egyptians are Africans? They are not actually allowed to have that. And that's actually, again, the problem I have with the British left. The British left, misguidingly, had a racist view that believed that only Muslims should actually be governed by Muslims. And it's really puzzling as why they actually supporting this actually fascist movement called Muslim Brotherhood, which were the first actually non-European group to support Hitler and join the German Nazi war efforts as from the 1930s, not even before the war had started. So that's a really puzzling situation from the British left. Going back to the situation of Saudi Arabia and America, it's of course every country would like to have a stake in another country. They support election in a certain way, support party, and even we have Russian oligarchs and American millionaires here when we hopefully, which none of our leaders give us, a referendum in Europe, we will see various sort of foreign interests pouring money into Britain in order to figure that out. I mean, that's
we will continue with you in the next section. Stay with us, Adil Darwish. After a very short break, stay with us. Let's move on now to the second and final section, where we will talk about the President Obama's trip to Riyadh. And let's talk to Adil Darwish about staging this trip to Saudi Arabia. Tell us more about Obama's failure to tackle human rights issues in Saudi.
Well, I don't know actually what you mean by a human rights issue in Saudi Arabia. I mean, they always sort of would come into discussion. I mean, it's the human rights. Are you talking to me or talking to Jeremy?
No, I'm talking to you.
Okay, right. I mean, there is. I mean, if you read the Amnesty International report, if you read the Human Rights Watch report, I mean, there's abuse everywhere, from Alaska all the way to Tasmania. I mean, even UK comes into it. I mean, every country will have sort of to balance their interest. On one hand, it's different from the British approach.
Mr. Corbyn would like to have some input and engage with you on that.
Well, no, I think it's very interesting that President Obama didn't see fit to discuss human rights. Saudi Arabia has recently become a member of the Human Rights Council and rather bizarrely has given a very substantial donation of $1 million to help it in its work. And the Universal Periodic Review contains a great deal of criticism about the treatment of women in society, about the use of the death penalty, about the treatment of migrant workers, about the failure of Saudi Arabia to allow rapporteurs from the UN to investigate human rights abuses there.
Yes.
And it's very odd that the Western governments in general have been very muted in their criticism, and regional governments also more or less completely silent in their criticism. Britain did raise the question of the death penalty during the UN meeting in Geneva on this, and some other countries also raised the question of women and rapporteurs, but in general there was a great deal of silence, and it seems to me that the issues of the treatment of migrant workers by Saudi Arabia is something that is an absolute scandal of deportations, wholesale deportations of Ethiopian, Eritrean and other people from the country. A small number of some migrant workers have been granted status in Saudi Arabia. The rest have either been deported or continue to work in appalling conditions. And the opposition to this should be centre stage. This is a human rights abuse par excellence in that country, and indeed in many Gulf states as well, in the treatment of migrant workers.
Adi Darwish, before you leave us today, do you think Obama could have done much better than honouring Mahal Munif, who started the National Family Safety Program in 2005 to combat domestic violence in Saudi Arabia? Apart from honouring this lady, we didn't see much going on, and it was quite a brief event in a hotel before he left.
Well, I think it's all symbolic. I mean, the Americans actually have the death penalties in more than half of their states. So, so it's a question of that's always the Saudis throw that at their face. So, I mean, I think the British approach is usually more effective because it's not a megaphone diplomacy. It's actually happening behind closed door, and it's persuasive, and it's more the change. And I actually find it really quite funny that actually in Jeremy's own constituencies, there are Muslim women who are worse treated in the Muslim communities there, yet the British left dare not speak or criticize for them, and even the police and agencies and local authorities are silent by this nonsense of political correctness. So it's not actually black and white in a human rights.
Sorry, that is a not really very sensible thing to say. In this country we have rights for all human beings, whatever their faith, whatever their religion. We have the rights of people to express their faith and their religion. To say that the British left as a whole, whoever that is supposed to be, is not interested in the rights of women in our society, or Muslim women, is simply a travesty of what you know the real situation to be.
Adi Darwish?
I didn't hear what was said, actually. I mean, it's a very bad line. I mean, I just sort of guessing what I'm just saying, you know, the hypocrisy of the British left. I'm actually challenging Jeremy that he can
could it be, Adi Darwish, could it be, you mentioned that it is a hypocrisy on the side of the British left.
It is part of hypocrisy, part of that double standard, part of something I don't understand. I'm just challenging Jeremy and many of Labour MPs in their own constituencies, where there are ghettos of Muslim communities there who abuse women, who implement Sharia law, who beat up children, who abuse children, and they got scot-free because of the political correctness. That's worse human rights abuse than in Saudi Arabia. Why don't we actually challenge that?
If I may say so, Mr. Darwish, I know of nobody who's a serious socialist who supports the abuse of women by anybody. I know of no one who's a serious socialist who supports discrimination. So please don't characterise what you know to be wrong in your statement.
Can I just say that
Mr. Spring,
on the issue of women in Saudi Arabia, there was and has been one overwhelming issue in the last month or so in Jeddah, I said Riyadh the other day on your programme, but it's actually in Jeddah.
Mm-hmm.
These are these girls, these princesses, who have been imprisoned by their father. Now, it may be terribly embarrassing to the Saudi monarchy that this situation has gone on, and I do hope that the British non-megaphone diplomacy is effective and working now to get these girls into UK or into the USA, anyway, out of the palace where they are being apparently, or were prior to the visit of Obama, seriously maltreated. They're very brave women. The mother is a very brave woman who did a protest outside the Saudi embassy. And I would hope that something can come out of the Obama visit that will actually ameliorate, relieve their situation.
Adil Darwish, thank you very much again for being with us, Westminster-based British political journalist. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now, before we continue our section, let's move to see a short report on President Obama's visit to Saudi Arabia.
For Obama, the disposition of the Saudis is now a main concern as he plots a policy towards both Syria and Iran. A central goal of his visit is to reassure Saudi Arabia that Washington's commitment to its security will not be compromised by negotiations with Iran. Riyadh encouraged the military's ouster of the Muslim Brotherhood from power and the subsequent crackdown on its supporters, while United States diplomats hustled in vain to avert both moves. The Obama administration is hoping to persuade Saudi Arabia to use its greater clout with Cairo to convince the government there to rein in its repression of the opposition and begin to overhaul its economy, the Western formula for restoring stability. In the past month, Saudi Arabia criminalized membership in the Muslim Brotherhood and classified it as a terrorist organization on par with Al-Qaeda. Saudi leaders are already vexed at Mr. Obama for failing to throw America's military might behind their proxy war with Tehran in Syria, where the Saudis are sending money and weapons to back the Sunni-dominated rebels. And the Saudis were flabbergasted last year when Mr. Obama reversed course at the last minute, calling off missile strikes against the Syrian government for its use of chemical weapons. Obama opted instead for a deal for President Assad to surrender the weapons, and then watched as the Syrian government rolled back the rebels using conventional force. And while Washington is not on the same wavelength with Saudi on Syria, Obama still hopes for Saudi help, especially in Egypt. But the question is Saudi prepared to shift to an on-demand alliance?
Mr. Corbyn, what is next for Saudi Arabia? Is there a possible scenario where the kingdom's Western allies would open avenues with other figures like Prince Mukran, for instance, who's been made deputy crown prince in Saudi Arabia?
I think it's very clear that the Western powers are all making overtures to different sections of the royal family. Clearly, if one is a preferred crown prince, they're going to build relations with them, but they're well aware that many of the family are very old, there aren't clear lines of succession, they're unclear what's going to happen in the future. And I think that there's going to be an awful lot of diplomacy going on with Saudi Arabia. I would like to think that diplomacy is going to be pressurizing on human rights issues and abuse, and I would like to think that pressure is going to be about developing democracy, but I really doubt it. It's all about economic relationships and strategic military relationships, where Saudi Arabia plays such a very important part in the Gulf Cooperation Council, and that is why Obama really went on this visit.
Mm-hmm. Now let's touch a little bit on Syria, which was in the essence of the rift between Riyadh and Washington. Saudi officials have grown particularly concerned about what they see as Obama's reluctance and varying response to the Syrian war, and these Saudi officials have pressed the US administration to allow them to play a direct role in supporting the rebels in Syria. Now, Mr. Spring, the US and Iran have signed an interim nuclear deal recently. Both are trying to maintain this deal as it's in their best interest to do so. Can the US choose not to allow further Saudi support in Syria, it's this particular choice not to allow them to do so? Can this be seen as a way to show Iran that it's willing to offer concessions in return of more concessions from the other side in the post-interim nuclear deal phase, in an attempt to pave the way for a permanent deal?
The Syrian situation is involved with the nuclear deal, possible nuclear deal, but in another sense, it's entirely unrelated. The facts are there is a dreadful civil war that's been going on in Syria for many years, several years. Unfortunately, the British and the Americans and the French have stirred the pot instead of seeking to mediate a settlement. And they have placed Assad's regime into a corner by, for example, at Geneva II, saying you must admit a transitional government, when in fact this was not, these Syrians nor the Iranians were at Geneva I, where that particular formula was agreed. The whole thing reminded me of the 1930s, when the Führer would just march into a country, bring along Chamberlain and say, we're going to have this, that and the other set up. And Victoria Nuland in Ukraine, where she's deciding who the new president of Ukraine is going to be, seems to be in the same ilk, the same sort of people. So I think they need to get a settlement in Syria by diplomacy, and that the use of force by the British, and I congratulate Jeremy, I'm very grateful I'm on this programme to do that personally.
Thank you.
Because I believe the British Parliament did a massive job in asserting, similar to the 1940 vote, I think, which brought down Chamberlain.
It was one of the most significant votes in Parliament all the time I've been there, because it was the British Parliament saying no to another military adventure. All wars have to end with a political settlement, and the war in Syria is no different. It just needs to be now. There are now 2 million refugees. Goodness knows how many dead as a result of this conflict and how much disruption as a result of it. But fueling it by pouring arms in from any quarter isn't going to solve it. It's going to merely extend the war, extend the killing, and extend the misery.
Absolutely right.
Let's see now what is happening here in the UK, where last summer MPs have rejected possible UK military action against Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's government. This has stirred reactions from France and the US. Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel said the US would continue to work with Britain and consult with Britain as, quote, we are with all our allies, while French President François Hollande told the newspapers he would still be willing to take action without Britain's involvement. Now, one thing that is certainly showed here is UK leadership. And for a change, the US followed the UK this time, with Obama suggesting a similar vote at the Congress, which never happened. Now, Mr. Corbyn, before we come to the end of this episode, I'd like to ask you, what was your vote at the time?
My vote was not to send military equipment or forces into Syria or to join with the US bombing of Syria. Because I felt that the proposal being put to us was for arming a particular group of opposition forces to President Assad, with no guarantee as to where those weapons would go or to against whom they were going to be used, and it would make the situation worse. And then, of course, the danger is of escalation beyond that. Think for a moment what would have happened if a British or American plane had been shot down by a Russian missile in Syria, where the Russians were supporting President Assad. Well, you can just think of a scenario that is very dangerous. The fact that the British Parliament said no, for a lot of different reasons, they weren't all the same reason, said no, meant there was immediate talks between the US and Russia, which brought about the chemical weapons agreement. There was immediate talks about a nuclear processing agreement with Iran. That was all a very good development and a very good step forward, and I'm not apologising one iota for the vote I took. I'm very proud of being able to take part in that decision, which I think is a fundamental change in British foreign policy.
And Mr. Spring, we know very well that the current government is basing a lot of its policy on economic growth, even its immigration policy here in the UK, which is tailored to attract the wealthiest, and it is seen by many as the right way to go, given the economic circumstances in the country and in Europe in general. So can Britain afford to upset Saudi Arabia or the Qataris, for instance? So especially, for example, when it relates to this investigation now, when it comes to the Muslim Brotherhood here in the UK, do you think the Prime Minister is saving face here by doing this investigation?
Well, yes, I think there is a need to be economical with l'argent, avec l'argent, oui. But the point is, we could be economical by one major thing: get rid of Trident. That would be a massive saver to the British exchequer.
Do you agree?
£100 billion is due to be spent on the replacement of Trident. If we don't replace Trident and instead invest in high technology engineering as well as in very many social needs in this country and elsewhere, we'd put ourselves in a much better position in world politics, not the position we're in at the present time. And the British government has that opportunity in the next Parliament in 2016 when that vote is going to take place. I will, for one, not be supporting the replacement of our nuclear weapons system. I want to live in a nuclear-free world, and we can help make that happen.
But speaking about saving money as well for Britain, so what about the money that the Saudis are investing in the UK, particularly in London, and the Qataris as well? So don't you think if they were upset, they might sort of boycott England?
Well, if people don't want to invest, they won't invest. But most of the money that's coming in from Russia, Qatar, Saudi Arabia is actually not being invested in productive engineering or productive industries. It's being invested in a London property bubble, which is having the effect of increasing dislocation of the whole housing market in London and resulting in rapidly increasing private rents, which are forcing many poorer people out of London, and an obscene number of very large empty properties all across London where they're just banking against an ever-growing property bubble. And so I think it's time to rein in the property bubble and start meeting housing for people's needs, not the profits or putative profits of banks.
Before we wrap up, very quickly, Mr. Spring, why now the Prime Minister decided to investigate, quote, the philosophy and the activities of the Muslim Brotherhood, particularly when it comes to security concerns in the UK?
Well,
is it pressure from Saudi Arabia?
The worrying thing is that it may well be pressure from Saudi Arabia, and of course from the Egyptian regime directly, and the Americans. This is a sort of trinity of evil, really. The Saudis and the UK and the Americans are all messing about in the Middle East. And what have we got as a result? Absolute chaos right through the Middle East. Libya was supposed to be sorted out by Cameron. It's at a completely ungovernable state, in a state of anarchy. Cameron should be brought to Parliament and asked, why did he do this? Why did he bomb the Libyans and bomb stability out of that country and set back their development so many years? That's another reason why the vote in Parliament against intervention in Syria was successful, because they'd seen what had happened in Libya. So, you know.
Before we end, I would just like to have your input on that, Mr. Corbyn.
I think the point Mr. Spring made is correct, that the way MPs voted was in part because of Libya, but also because of Iraq and Afghanistan, and also public opinion in Britain, which is not in favour of further military adventures. There's a different mood developing, not just in Britain, but across Western Europe. And I think François Hollande is well out of touch with what an awful lot of people really feel. And I think we're moving into an era when public opinion is tired of wars of intervention and want to see something different, and it's time that NATO and the leaders got a grip of that.
And my very last question for any one of you, whoever volunteers: China is replacing America as the new biggest world power, arguably. Could we say that the US government is afraid they lost Saudi to the Chinese, or they could lose Saudi Arabia to the Chinese?
Well, I think they're pretty paranoid about losing anywhere to the Chinese, actually, which is why Obama is pouring so much money and resources into a military presence in Asia-Pacific region rather than Europe and the Mediterranean, which is where the US have traditionally put a huge emphasis. But they want to be careful, because China actually has more dollar reserves than the US government, and the Chinese government can quite easily pull the plug on the US economy any time it wants to.
Yes, I agree with you, Jeremy, on that one. So Africa, you look at Africa, Chinese development and expansion there.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Spring, for your contribution, and Mr. Corbyn for coming to join us today, MP Jeremy Corbyn. As this episode comes to an end, let's have a quick wrap up on what happened. We spoke to Mr. Adi Darwish over the phone, who argues that there is no such thing as major Saudi interference in Egyptian issues. And he also argued with Mr. Corbyn about the ghettoization amongst the immigrants here in the US, and that came when we spoke about human rights in Saudi Arabia. It was in defense of Saudi Arabia. We also spoke to Mr. William Spring, who argues that the West might be a little bit better off not intervening, especially militarily, in the Middle East, and
Would be a lot better off.
it would be much better, as he said. Thank you very much for everyone, and see you soon on Straightforward Levant TV.